Hey everybody, welcome to the Athletic Potential Podcast. This is episode 18, and today we are going to be discussing sports hernias. We're going to be discussing recovering between starts, as well as talking about how we integrate technology here at Athletic Potential. All right, as a brief overview of each episode, we typically start with a case. It's usually the last patient I treated prior to the recording of this episode, and then we go into questions from our audience, and then finish with a general summary and recap. So let's jump right into our case. Our case today is a 22-year-old male baseball player, position player, predominantly plays infield, either second or shortstop, and does sporadically play in the outfield. However, he's been dealing with a chronic issue of what he initially termed to me as a groin strain. And he was seen by his organization. He's a professional baseball player. He's seen by his organization, and they diagnosed him with what's called a sports hernia. And when we initially saw him, he'd been dealing with this for a long time. He had a lot of different treatments with it, and most of which were fairly successful, but he still continued to have pain, specifically with hard sprinting and change of directions, occasionally when swinging. And so he was seeing us at this time to be able to continue training and also be able to continue to play, and looking for treatment and ways to help him get better. Now, the hardest part in regards to his initial examination does require a little bit of explanation, but sports hernias are not true hernias. They're basically a muscle strain of either the muscles of the adductor group or the groin muscles as they attach to the pubic bone in the pelvis, or they're a strain of our ab muscles as they attach to the top side of the pubic bone. And so part of diagnosis is determining which side of the pubic bone the pain is, because that'll tell us if it's the abs or if it's the groin muscle group. And in his case, we identified it as above the pubic bone, indicating it was coming from the rectus abdominis or abs. Now, that kind of gave us an idea of how we were going to treat it. But in his case, the hard part is it had been around for so long and he's had so many other treatments that were fairly effective but not fully effective, that we had to basically decide and kind of think outside the box how we wanted to treat this. And so, much like muscle strains that we see, specifically ones that are more tendinous where they attach to the bone, we have to get that tissue to turn over, and anything that's been around for a long period of time needs basically to get the healing process started again. Unless they're in a current healing process, and he wasn't. And so my favorite way to do that, and this is what we ended up doing with him, was we employed dry needling. And so we did dry needling at the site of his injury, just above the pubic bone where that rectus abdominis muscle attaches, and we coupled that with very specific exercises that would lengthen the rectus abdominis under stress. I think the main muscles or main exercises we were having him use were fallouts, ring fallouts, or Superman's using a ring where he's extending his arms. I think ab rollouts. That's pretty much what he was doing, but he was using a suspension trainer to do it. We did plyo ball throws and med ball throws in different kneeling positions, making sure he maintained pelvic neutral, and really tried to stress where that muscle attached to the pubic bone. And we were able to do this for quite a little while. We ended up treating him for about 8 to 12 treatments with this. And I can definitely say, in regards to his return, he was able to return with no pain, which was the first time he hasn't had pain in quite some time, many months. And so it worked out fairly well. And I think one of the key factors, not only that the dry needling was effective, but I think dry needling was actually the reason why things started to improve for him. We just couldn't affect the tissue in a way to get it to turn over and heal. But I think the key with him was that he was very regimented to his exercise program. He didn't deviate, he stayed with it, and we progressively overloaded that tissue and caused it to change over time. It did take quite a bit of oversight from our standpoint. However, we tested it quite frequently, and what we've noticed is he actually plateaued doing med ball throws, and we didn't really see any change in the tissue for a while, and that was all indicated by the fact that he still could feel it when he would try to plant and run at a hard sprint. And so we had to really ramp up his protocols in regards to med ball throws and different hip positions and movements and speeds, and that's what really put it over the top. And so kind of reviewing this case, it took correct diagnosis to identify where the tissue that was damaged, and then identify where it was damaged, and then how we could actually approach it. We definitely identified that he needed to restart the healing process, and we used dry needling to do that. We also, as a side note, dry needling definitely helps with pain control, and so that was probably also a reason why he saw success. However, I think that the needles themselves causing a return of that inflammatory process and the healing process really helped him to improve. And then we progressed him with close supervision, and we had to progress him very strategically, and then we had to monitor it constantly, because if we hadn't monitored it, I don't think we would have caught his plateau. And I think what ended up happening is he would have gone back to playing and noticed that he still had pain with hard turns and runs and sprints, I should say. But when we noticed that he wasn't improving and he plateaued, we were able to modify his exercise program to continue to stress the tissue at higher levels. And I believe that's the reason why he ended up seeing the results that he did. So kind of a fun case. We're really happy he's doing well with no pain, and actually he's doing quite well right now in his professional season. And so fun case of a sports hernia, which is not really a true hernia. It's a muscle strain, typically at the insertion point where it comes together at the pubic bone. And so yeah, fun case. Happy to see the results we did. Another good result from dry needling, which seems to be the case when appropriately applied. Dry needling seems to work out really well, and in his case it worked out really well. So all right, that does it for our case today. So we're going to jump into our questions from our audience, and our first question comes from Derek, and he asks, I have read a lot about different ways of recovering between starts in pitching. What are some key items that you use with your players / pitchers at your facility? Well, this is a great question, Derek, because this really all depends. Obviously, with our starting pitchers, they're going to go out and pitch depending on if they're professional or collegiate or even high school. That'll determine the frequency that they're going to return to the mound. And the general principle that I like to use is that we want to return our pitchers back to normal, the closest that we can back to normal prior to them getting back on the mound to compete. What that basically means is if they go out and pitch and they have their elbow doesn't extend all the way, maybe they get like biceps tightness or something like that limits their ability to extend their elbow back to normal, then we want to clean that up before they get back out and pitch. If their shoulder demonstrates signs of fatigue, we want to do things that will help improve their muscle recovery. Now, I know you're asking specific questions, and I'll get into that. If we're looking at hip range of motion, or maybe they're showing signs of core fatigue and inability to maintain proper spine position, then we want to do things that are going to improve that before they go back out again and pitch again. The reason is because this is typically, injuries in baseball and pitching typically happen like a slow drip process. And they start to show signs, they start to show more signs, and then eventually what happens is something gets overloaded and overused, and then they break down, and then it requires time off. Now, if we can identify those areas before they become a problem, meaning we can get them back to normal between every start, then we decrease the chance of them sustaining an injury. Doesn't mean that we completely get rid of it, that risk of injury, but it does mean that we kind of stay ahead of injuries at that point. So that being said, we try to get back to normal. So let's talk about, say we got a professional pitcher who's going to go out and pitch every 5 days. What we want to make sure that we instigate with that pitcher is he has days that are very low in intensity, meaning that he's not going to do very much during that time period. Now, this can also apply to softball pitchers, and I just had this conversation with somebody about softball pitchers and how they recover. It's obviously a lot different. They throw a lot more pitches and they pitch on a higher frequency level, but I still feel like the principles are about the same, but there are some things that we have to take into more consideration with our softball pitchers just based on how frequently they throw. But if we're talking about baseball pitchers in professional setting where they're starting every 5 days, and sometimes the high schools will do this too, is we really want to make sure that the day after they pitch, And a 5-day rotation is typically a very low intensity day. They do things just to promote blood flow and do things just to get their body moving again. We're not having them do big lifts this day. We're not having them do a lot of shoulder work, those type of things. They may throw, but their throwing session is fairly low intensity and low effort, with the main goal of just creating a sense of flexible arm. It's mainly a feel thing for each one of the guys, but the idea is just enough to get blood flow to the muscles that need it, enough to keep their arm loose and their shoulder motion there where it needs to be, and then we don't have them do much that next day. Now the following day is a higher day where we have them come back and they throw a little bit more. Maybe this is a long toss or a reach out program, and they do a little bit more of a lift, heavier lift that day. And then we look at day 3 or 4 where we're asking them basically they have to throw a bullpen at some point, and so it depends on that pitcher at that point. And so if they're going to throw a bullpen on day 3, then that's a higher day. Then we may take actually the first day after their start and the second day after their start on very low days. They'll go back up high, throw a bullpen on day 3, go low on day 4, pitch again on day 5. So it gets pretty intricate here. There's some good resources out there in regards to how to recover maybe these high and low model. What I found in most of our cases when we consult with our professional pitchers of this level, most all of them that are in the starting role have either been on what they considered a high-low model, meaning they take days off, but then they would throw, have a higher day where they do a higher intensity. And what we found is their high days were too low and their low days were too high. And so they actually had this moderate day for 5 straight days. And what we found is that really didn't work. We noticed some additional problems in regards to range of motion and strength and fatigue when they did that. And so we really had to regulate and find ways for them to measure their intensity levels, those type of things. And most of the time, the professional organizations have something to help monitor them, whether even it's just somebody that can help keep track of the innings and those type of things. But what we found is that when we actually made true high days and true low days with professional pitchers, that allowed our starters to get back to normal a lot faster. Now, in regards to you asked a specific question in regards to starts and pitching, so I'm willing about we're talking about starters a little bit more here in your question, Derek. As a note for relievers, that's obviously a lot harder. What we found with relievers is they need a very consistent schedule throughout the season. They lift on the same days whether they think they're going to pitch that day or not. They do mobility, they do low days on days when they just try to schedule everything and keep everything consistent throughout the course of the season. And the reason is because it's so variable when they're going to pitch that it's really hard not to just stay consistent. It's really hard not to see losses in range of motion and strength and fatigue, those kind of things, without staying consistent, because otherwise they start missing lifts and they don't get the recovery work in that they need if they don't already have a set schedule. And so relievers are a little bit different, but the idea is to set a schedule for them. College, they start once every 7 days typically. So Friday night guy is going to pitch every Friday night. We still use the same high to low model, but the difference is now we're afforded a lot more variance in the program. And so we have them do different things on different days, but again, keep their high days high and low days low. High school is the same way. Obviously, we just keep an eye on how frequent they're going to pitch. Now, in regards to your question a little bit, Derek, that was kind of more of a general principle. We're trying to get everybody back to normal prior to their next outing. However, we definitely use that high to low model when we counsel with our players. So you talked about what are some key items that you use with your players. I can tell you this, that we're big into promoting blood flow immediately after the start. And so if they pitched, say, Friday night, they're using some sort of device that's going to help improve blood flow. It's usually an electrical stimulation device. We use Mark Pros. We use Compex devices. There's a couple other that we're out there using. To be honest, we predominantly use Mark Pro, or I primarily recommend Mark Pro. I have no affiliation with Mark Pro or anything like that. But the idea is it's a great product and helps to just promote blood flow. And they don't have to actually think about when they do it. These protocols are hour-long to 2-hour-long protocols after they throw. And all it does is it just promotes a continuous blood flow throughout the muscle, but in a non-fatiguing capacity. So we tell everybody, look, the device doesn't matter so long as it's a non-fatiguing muscle contraction that you're not doing cognitively. It's just something that the machine does for you. You don't have to think about it. And we leave that on for hours at a time. That's something that we use constantly following our starts, and on days that they need more recovery, we'll use longer protocols. On the days they don't need as much recovery, maybe they're feeling pretty good, then they use the Mark Pros or those electrical stimulation devices for less time. But it seems like most of the time we've got a lot of guys using these electrical stim devices I would say every day between their starts, and it seems to work out pretty well for them. So that's one thing we do. I think the lowest hanging fruit we see in Derek, I don't know if you're the starter, if you're the player, or if you have a child or a coach. I can tell you this, that the lowest hanging fruit here is not these fancy gimmicky, I wouldn't say they're even gimmicky, they work, right? But not these using these machines and the boots and all these kind of things. Those things are great, they really, really work. But I can tell you right now, if your athletes are not hydrating properly, they're not eating well, then you're not sleeping well, then you're really missing the areas where they're going to see the biggest improvements. And so a lot of our high school kids just don't sleep well enough. We've instigated technology type things. We give them sleep habits, and we call it sleep hygiene. We talk about not using screens within certain times of bed based on recommendations on a few studies and books. And what we found is in our high school athletes, if they just adhere to some of these sleep protocols, sleep hygienes, then we see recovery skyrocket in these athletes because they actually sleep, they actually get good sleep. And then if we actually incorporate hydration and good nutrition on the backside of that as well, in addition to sleep, then we see great recovery in our high school athletes. The higher level athletes, collegiate and professional guys, they need to do more of these recovery protocols using the electrical stimulation devices. However, even those guys, they have a tough sleep schedule. If they're playing at night, they don't get home until midnight, 1 o'clock. They're all amped up from their start. It takes them a lot longer to get to bed, and maybe 2 a.m. and they're not waking up till 10 to 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. the next day. And that's gonna be a tough schedule to do. But the idea is at that point we monitor sleep, you monitor quality of sleep, you maintain this proper sleep hygiene, you get good food, you get good hydration at the right times, and what we see is better recovery. And so to kind of bring it all together for you here, Derek, have a high and low model. So make sure that you're taking good rest. So make sure that when you are throwing, your athletes are getting ready for their next start, that those high intensity days are higher intensity days, and that the days where they're not and they're doing low intensity days are actually low intensity days. Make sure they're sleeping well, make sure they're eating well, make sure they're hydrating, and make sure they're getting some sort of blood flow to the muscles that need it as best as possible and as much as possible between their starts. I'd say those things right there, if you can instigate those in whatever level of baseball you're in, you're going to see some pretty good results if you're not doing them already. I know I'm going to get a comment or something about this, about icing. We don't ice any of our athletes. We only guys that ice are the ones that just swear by it, and every athlete's their own individual. And if guys are telling me that the only way their arm seems to recover really well is if they ice, then I'll say, great, you can ice, but then I also need you to do all these other things that we also teach. And so I rarely have our guys ice, and I don't recommend icing anymore. I recommend more of this blood flow type recovery pattern, and it seems to work a little bit better. And I don't think we've really seen any negative effect of stopping icing on anybody. And so if that tells you anything, we've seen hundreds of athletes and no negative effects to stopping ice. And so anyways, hope that answers your question, Derek. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. All right, our next question comes from Paul. Paul says, on your Instagram, thanks for looking at my Instagram, I have seen you using a variety of different devices to assist with your athletes. What devices do you use and or would recommend? So when we talk about devices, Paul, just to clarify, you're probably thinking you see guys hooked up to wires, tubes, us using screens, and those type of things to assist our athletes in whatever they're doing. And so, yeah, this is a great question. So we definitely integrate technology a lot into our training here at Athletic Potential. We just talked about recovery strategies. We use a lot of technology with recovery strategies. We definitely use the electrical stimulation to promote blood flow. We haven't integrated any of the compression boots yet, but that is something that we've definitely thought about using more and more, as it seems that as we get a little bit more of lower extremity type things, that seems to work a little bit better. We use other modalities that more fall into the physical therapy realm, ultrasound, those type of things that seem to help our athletes recover, but also not only that, but train and continue to train at high levels. I can tell you this, that we just started using a biofeedback unit that's been so far highly effective at helping our athletes get better muscle contraction and quality. We're also able to identify deficiencies and things that we couldn't see before, but that now we can actually see based on how well the muscles are firing. We use blood flow restriction a lot, and so I think a lot of the Instagram, the photos or the videos that you see and the reels that you see are us using blood flow restriction in addition to doing exercise. That is something that we use heavily on all of our athletes. It's not something we wear all the time when they work out, but it's definitely when they're doing specific exercise routines that we'll use blood flow restriction training. What else do we use? We use electrical stimulation in many different capacities. We use video analysis. We measure different things with using video. That's not something that's typically on there on my Instagram, but it's definitely something we use. We use force platforms. We use radar guns, not only for throwing, but we use them for other movements that we can measure velocity that we think will give us a better idea of how our athlete's improving. And so, Paul, it's a great question. I guess you asked what devices do you use and or would recommend. It depends on who you are, what you are, if you're the athlete, if you're the parent. If you're a parent looking to help your child improve in regards to using technology devices, that's a great question, because really it depends on where your athlete is in the process of their development. I would tell you, if they're not doing training, obviously you need to do training, but let's say they're doing training, they're involved in a good training program that, well, let me give you this story. So this is a good story, and it may illustrate how you can apply and make decisions based on what technology you feel like you need at the time. So I have an athlete that travels from a fair distance away from us, hours drive, and his dad had actually purchased a radar gun, a handheld radar gun, and was monitoring how hard his child was throwing. He lives in a very small town. It's not something that a lot of people had, but he started looking at how fast his son was throwing. And to full disclosure for him, he was just making sure his son would throw hard enough and wanted him to throw harder. He didn't think he would end up using it for this capacity. But what he noticed is that he started tracking his son's velocity. And over the course of a season, he noticed his son's velocity was staying the same, which is good. But then all of a sudden he noticed after a weekend at a tournament, his son's velocity dropped by about 3 miles an hour. That velocity did not improve in about 7 to 10 days and actually decreased another couple miles an hour. So he had a total drop of 5 miles an hour. At that point, he asked his son, "Hey, what's going on? Do you feel? How's your arm? Is everything feeling okay?" And his son came back, "Yeah, I'm feeling good. My arm feels tired." And his dad said, "Okay, well, is your arm tired, or is it hurting, or is it both, or what's going on?" And his son then eventually came out and told him, he's like, "Look, yeah, my arm's been hurting a little bit, and I think it's because my arm's tired." And what we found out is his son's is 12 years old, 13 years old, and ended up having the very beginning part of little ear syndrome in his elbow or shoulder. To be honest, it's hard to remember. But he had these signs of little ear syndrome in his arm. And what ended up happening was his father caught it, and they were able to address it and which allowed him to turn his time around in regards to recovery substantially faster than previously. So that's one way to think about maybe using technologies that maybe your radar gun's a good idea at this point. I have an 11-year-old daughter who plays softball. I don't feel like she needs a whole lot of electrical stimulation and those type of things, but what I can tell you is that we've seen some significant improvements using a handheld radar in regards to her ability to throw across the diamond, how hard she's hitting a baseball or softball, and how hard she's pitching with a windmill pitch. So I think radar gun for an 11-year-old girl at this point sounds pretty good, and that'd be kind of maybe our technology that we'd use for her. Now, I just recommended to a 17-year-old baseball player yesterday that he needed to go purchase an electrical stimulation device that allows him to recover a little bit better. That's a Mark Pro or a Compex unit, and what we've noticed is that it seems like the higher level we get, the more I'm recommending that piece of technology as a form of recovery. And so, Paul, it's a great question. There definitely are other things that you could buy, but I think the things that the question you want to ask yourself is, what's going to allow me as a parent to be able to monitor whether I'm getting better or worse, and also maybe help me identify when I'm on a bad path, maybe path toward injury. And if you don't have any type of measurement now, then it's a good time to maybe consider what that looks like. From a parent standpoint, you're not measuring joint angles or forces or anything like that. That's a tough thing to measure. Mainly clinicians and other people will do that. But maybe just monitoring how hard they throw, or even there's devices they can wear on their arm now that tell you torque and arm speed, and look for trends with that. We use that as well. Our guys returning to throw, they all wear that device on their elbow to determine, just intensities and mainly looking for trends and changes. And so I hope this gives you some answers, Paul. I feel like I didn't really answer your question directly. So if I didn't, or you want more specific answer for your situation, just shoot me an email at mike@athletic-potential.com. And let's get your question answered. But I hope it kind of gives just a general insight of technology is a great thing, and we definitely use it. And from a parent standpoint, from a player standpoint, buying the right technology to help track your progress, or just give you an idea of what normal looks like for you, and then to use that data to help make better decisions in regards to recovery and training is a fantastic idea. And so I definitely would recommend it. So, all right, well, that's our last question for today on this podcast, on episode 18. So as a general recap, we talked about a professional baseball player who had a sports hernia. We used dry needling and progressive overload in regards to training, and had to monitor it fairly effectively or intensively to get him all the way back and better. And it definitely worked, which is fantastic. But I think in regards to takeaway from that, make sure you get a good, correct diagnosis. Make sure you then monitor your progress and make sure everything's progressing the way you want to see it. It sounds like a little bit of a trend going on right now. We talked about monitoring progress using technology, and buying the right types of technology at the time to monitor progress or to improve recovery, those type of things. That was from Paul. We also had that question from Derek talking about key ways of recovering between starts, and basically to have a plan and to work your plan and stay with it. Make sure your high days are high, your low days are low, and that you're sleeping, eating, and hydrating well. And then making sure if you can incorporate any other recovery strategies using electrical stimulation or blood flow improvement, those are all good ideas. So anyways, that does it for our episode 18 of the podcast. I appreciate everybody's listening, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.